You knew who I was all along?
No. I knew who you became. I just never knew who you were before.
Then why didn't you come after me?
Because the woman I loved wasn't a billionaire.
Sometimes the biggest lies are told with good intentions. Victoria Hayes believed pretending to be poor would help her find true love. Instead, it almost destroyed the only person who had ever loved her for exactly who she was. But to understand how one faded receipt became the most important piece of evidence in her life, we have to go back almost a year. The Hayes name appeared on hospitals, universities, museums, and skyscrapers across the country. To the world, Richard Hayes was one of America's most respected billionaires. A self-made entrepreneur who had transformed a small logistics company into Hayes International Holdings, a global business empire. To Victoria, he was simply Dad. Growing up inside the Hayes estate looked perfect from the outside. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway. Private jets waited whenever the family wanted to travel. Birthday parties were covered by magazines. Every holiday looked like a movie. Yet none of those things ever made Victoria feel rich. What she wanted couldn't be bought. She wanted someone who would look at her without first calculating what her last name was worth. As a teenager, she noticed it in small ways. Classmates suddenly became friendly after learning who her father was. Parents encouraged their sons to ask her out. Even teachers sometimes treated her differently. She learned very early that wealth could open doors. It could also hide people's true intentions. Richard often reminded her of something he had learned the hard way. Money doesn't change people. It reveals them. At 27, Victoria thought she had finally found someone different. His name was Eric. He was charming, attentive, and always seemed to know exactly what to say. For almost 2 years she believed they were building a future together. Then everything collapsed. 3 weeks before their wedding, Victoria accidentally overheard Eric speaking to a friend. She hadn't intended to listen. She had simply walked back into the penthouse after forgetting her phone. His voice echoed from the study. Once we're married, access to the company becomes much easier. Victoria stopped walking. I don't have to love her forever, Eric laughed softly. I just have to stay married long enough. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. She quietly placed the forgotten phone back on the hallway table. She walked out the front door without making a sound. She never returned to finish planning the wedding. The engagement ended the next morning. Publicly, the newspapers described it as irreconcilable differences. Only Victoria knew the real reason. She had once again fallen in love with someone who loved her family's fortune more than her heart. Months passed. The pain faded. The fear remained. Every compliment made her wonder. Every smile felt suspicious. Every invitation carried a question. Would they still choose me? If they thought I had nothing? One rainy afternoon, Victoria walked into her father's office carrying nothing except a small backpack. Richard looked up from a stack of contracts. Something about his daughter's expression immediately told him this wasn't an ordinary visit. I've made a decision, she said quietly. He removed his glasses. I'm listening. Victoria took a slow breath. I want to disappear. Richard frowned. What does that mean? I want to leave this life for a while. You need a vacation? She shook her head. I need a normal life. The room fell silent. I want people to meet Victoria, not Victoria Hayes. Richard leaned back. You know that's impossible. It isn't. They'll recognize you. I'll move. They'll search for you. I'll keep my distance. They'll eventually find out. Victoria nodded. Maybe. But before they do, I want to know what it feels like when someone likes me without knowing my last name. Richard stood and slowly walked toward the window. For several seconds he said nothing. He understood why she wanted this. He also understood how dangerous it could become. Finally he turned around. If I say no? Victoria smiled sadly. I'll probably do it anyway. Richard couldn't help laughing. She had inherited his stubbornness. If we're doing this, he said, we do it safely. Over the next month, the Hayes legal team quietly arranged everything without attracting media attention. A modest apartment was rented in Brooklyn under Victoria's middle name. A simple used sedan replaced her luxury vehicles. Designer clothes disappeared into storage. Jewelry stayed locked inside the family vault. A new resume was created. No references. No famous last name. Just Victoria Reed. A woman looking for a fresh start. The first morning in her tiny apartment surprised her. No chef prepared breakfast. No chauffeur waited downstairs. No assistants reminded her about meetings. The refrigerator contained only eggs, bread, milk and fruit she had purchased herself. For the first time in her life, every decision belonged only to her. It felt frightening. It also felt freeing. She found work at a cozy neighborhood bookstore, where the owner, Mrs. Kaplan, hired her without recognizing her face from magazine covers. The pay wasn't much. The shelves were dusty. The floors creaked. Customers lingered for hours discussing novels over coffee. Victoria loved every minute. She stocked books, wrapped gifts, recommended stories to children, listened to lonely customers who simply wanted someone to talk to. For the first time in years, people appreciated her kindness instead of her connections. She didn't realize it then, but somewhere across the city, another ordinary day was unfolding. A day that would quietly set her future in motion. A young architect named Daniel Brooks was standing in his late mother's small kitchen, staring at an overdue mortgage notice lying beside a faded family photograph. He had no idea that before the week was over, his life would become forever intertwined with a woman who had given up billions in search of one honest heart. The first time Victoria noticed Daniel Brooks, he wasn't looking at books. He was kneeling on the floor, tightening the loose leg of an old wooden reading bench while Mrs. Kaplan apologized for calling him in on his only day off. Daniel volunteered at the community center next door every weekend, and whenever something in the bookstore broke, Mrs. Kaplan called him before she called a repair company. Victoria watched from behind the checkout counter. His clothes were clean but worn. His work boots had clearly been repaired more than once. There was nothing remarkable about his appearance. Yet there was something calming about the way he carried himself. He finished repairing the bench before standing. "I think it'll survive a few more years," he said with a smile. Mrs. Kaplan laughed. "I've been saying that for 10. Daniel shrugged. "I'll come back when it finally gives up." Victoria smiled without realizing it. As Daniel turned to leave, one of the children's books slipped from a display and landed near his feet. He picked it up carefully and walked toward the counter. "You should move this display," he said politely. "Someone could trip." Victoria nodded. "I just set it up. It's a nice display." He hesitated. "I just don't want anyone getting hurt." That simple sentence stayed with her long after he left. Most people pointed out problems. Daniel quietly solved them. For the next few weeks, Daniel became a familiar face. Sometimes he stopped by after work. Sometimes he brought donated books for neighborhood children. Sometimes he simply bought coffee and spent 20 minutes reading before heading home. Neither of them tried to impress the other. Their conversations were ordinary. Favorite novels. Bad coffee. Rainy weather. The stray cat that slept outside the bookstore every afternoon. It was the kind of friendship Victoria had secretly wished for her entire life. No one asked about her family. No one cared where she came from. She was simply Victoria. Daniel's life looked nothing like Victoria's. Every paycheck disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Mortgage payments, college tuition for Emily, medical debt left from their mother's illness, unexpected repairs. There was never much left. Yet every Friday evening he still stopped at the neighborhood bakery. He always bought 2 cinnamon rolls. One for himself. One for Emily. It had become their tradition after their mother passed away. Small traditions were sometimes the only things holding broken families together. Victoria never knew any of this. She only knew Daniel always looked tired. And that somehow, he never complained. One stormy evening, Victoria found a wallet outside the bookstore entrance. Inside was nearly $2,000 in cash. There was also a business card belonging to a wealthy real estate developer. Mrs. Kaplan looked surprised. "Most people would have kept it." Victoria smiled. "It isn't mine." An hour later, the owner rushed into the bookstore drenched from the rain. He counted every dollar. Nothing was missing. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," Victoria answered. "You trusted that someone would return it." The man insisted on giving her a reward. She refused. Daniel happened to walk in just as the businessman left. You turned down $2,000? Victoria shrugged. It wasn't mine. Daniel smiled. I guess honest people still exist. Neither of them noticed a man sitting across the street inside a black sedan. He lowered a pair of binoculars, then quietly made a phone call. Charles Monroe stared at the surveillance photograph lying on his desk. Victoria Hayes, working in a neighborhood bookstore, wearing secondhand clothes, living under another name. He smiled slowly. So that's your little experiment. He closed the file. No one disappears forever. Daniel invited Victoria to Emily's birthday dinner. It wasn't an expensive restaurant, just a tiny family diner with faded booths and homemade pie. Victoria had never felt more nervous. She bought Emily a simple notebook after hearing Daniel mention that his sister dreamed of becoming a nurse and liked writing about every patient she met. Emily opened the gift. You remembered. Victoria smiled. You talked about it once. Emily hugged her. No designer handbag, no expensive jewelry, had ever made Victoria feel as appreciated as that hug. For the first time in years, she felt like part of a family. Later that evening, while everyone laughed over dessert, Victoria excused herself to answer a phone call. It was her father. You've been gone 4 months. I know. Are you happy? She looked through the restaurant window toward Daniel and Emily. I think I'm finally learning what normal feels like. Richard smiled softly on the other end. I've never heard you sound this peaceful. Neither of them realized someone nearby had overheard only one sentence. Yes, my father owns the company. The waitress looked confused. Victoria quickly ended the call. A tiny misunderstanding had just been born. A week later, Mrs. Kaplan walked into the bookstore holding 2 elegant envelopes. A charity gala is looking for volunteers. Victoria's heart nearly stopped. The event was organized by Hayes International. She quietly declined. I have plans. Mrs. Kaplan looked disappointed. I thought you'd enjoy it. That same afternoon, Daniel received an invitation from his architecture firm. His company had been hired to redesign part of the Hayes Foundation headquarters. Attendance at the gala was mandatory. Daniel joked. Maybe I'll meet some billionaire. Victoria forced a smile. I doubt they're very interesting. Daniel laughed. You'd be surprised. She wasn't laughing. If Daniel attended, would he recognize her? Would someone recognize her first? For the first time since leaving her old life, Victoria wondered if her secret was beginning to crack. That night she couldn't sleep. She looked around the tiny apartment she had grown to love. The second-hand furniture. The chipped coffee mug Daniel had accidentally dropped and glued back together. The worn sneakers by the door. Everything represented the life she had chosen. But secrets had a way of demanding payment. And Victoria feared the bill was finally coming due. Far across the city, Charles Monroe closed another file and made one final note beneath Victoria's photograph. Begin Phase 2. Victoria still believed she was hiding from the world. She had no idea. The world had already found her. For 5 months, Victoria had successfully lived 2 separate lives. One belonged to Victoria Hayes, the billionaire heiress whose face occasionally appeared in business magazines. The other belonged to Victoria Reed, the quiet bookstore employee who loved recommending novels to children and sharing coffee with a man who had never once asked how much money she had. She always knew those 2 worlds would eventually collide. She simply hadn't expected it to happen tonight. Mrs. Kaplan had convinced her to volunteer after another employee became sick. No one will recognize you, she had said. Victoria wanted to believe that. She tied her hair into a simple bun, wore almost no makeup, and avoided the expensive jewelry she once wore without thinking. She looked like any other volunteer. Almost. Inside the ballroom, Daniel stood with several co-workers from his architecture firm. His company had recently won a contract to redesign one of the Hayes Foundation's community education centers. He had no idea Victoria was only a few rooms away. The evening began normally. Guests chatted. Servers carried trays of champagne. A string quartet played softly. Then Richard Hayes stepped onto the stage. The room immediately fell silent. Daniel politely applauded with everyone else. He had seen Richard Hayes on television before. He never imagined he would meet him in person. As Richard thanked donors for supporting children's literacy programs, Victoria quietly watched from behind a curtain. Pride filled her heart. Her father genuinely wanted to help people. Money had never changed that. Then Richard unexpectedly announced something. "My daughter has always been the inspiration behind this foundation." Victoria froze. She hadn't known he planned to mention her. A giant screen behind him displayed photographs from previous charity events. One image appeared for only a few seconds, but it was enough. Daniel looked up. His smile slowly disappeared. The woman standing beside Richard Hayes, the woman smiling in the photograph, looked exactly like Victoria. No, it couldn't be. He stared harder. His heart began beating faster. The same smile, the same eyes, the same tiny scar near her eyebrow. His mind searched desperately for another explanation. There wasn't one. Daniel walked outside into the cool evening air. Nothing made sense anymore. Why had Victoria never mentioned this? Why was her picture beside one of the richest men in America? Why was she pretending to be someone else? Before he could think any further, a voice interrupted him. "Daniel Brooks." He turned. A sharply dressed man extended his hand. "I'm Charles Monroe." Daniel recognized the name. One of Hayes International's senior executives. "I've heard good things about your work." Daniel shook his hand politely. Charles smiled. "I was hoping we could have a quick conversation." They walked toward a quiet garden overlooking the city. Charles appeared friendly, professional, relaxed. Exactly the kind of executive Daniel expected to meet. "I understand you're close to Victoria." Daniel hesitated. "Victoria?" Charles watched his reaction carefully. "So she never told you?" Daniel said nothing. Charles continued. "She's Richard Hayes' daughter." Silence. Daniel looked toward the ballroom windows. His entire relationship suddenly felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. Charles sighed dramatically. "She's been running an experiment." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "She likes pretending to be ordinary." Daniel immediately shook his head. "No." Charles smiled sympathetically. "You don't believe me. I know her. Do you?" Charles removed a small envelope from his jacket. Inside were photographs. Victoria stepping out of private helicopters. Victoria attending charity galas. Victoria beside world leaders. Every picture was real. Every picture shattered another piece of Daniel's certainty. Charles lowered his voice. "You're a good man. I don't understand. I don't think she ever intended to hurt you." Daniel's hands tightened around the photographs. "Then why lie?" Charles shrugged. "You'd have to ask her." For the first time since meeting Victoria, Daniel questioned everything. 2 days later, Daniel asked Victoria if they could talk. She agreed immediately. Before she reached his apartment, Charles arrived first. He told Daniel he wanted to discuss a possible architectural partnership. Daniel reluctantly allowed him inside. Charles placed a folder on the kitchen table. "It could change your life. I already have a job. This opportunity pays 10 times more." Daniel looked skeptical. "What's the catch?" Charles smiled. "Stay close to Victoria." At that exact moment, Victoria reached the apartment door. She had been about to knock. Instead, she heard Charles's voice through the slightly open door. "If you stay close to her, you'll never have to worry about money again." Victoria stopped breathing. Her worst fear had just become reality. Every painful memory of Eric came rushing back. Every doubt. Every sleepless night. Every question she had tried to bury. She closed her eyes. A tear rolled down her cheek. Without making a sound, she walked away. Inside the apartment, Charles continued speaking. "Because once this education center is approved, your firm will have years of guaranteed work." Daniel frowned. "I thought you were talking about Victoria." Charles laughed lightly. "No." Daniel looked directly at him. "I don't care how much money this project brings." Charles raised an eyebrow. "If helping your company means hurting innocent people." Daniel pushed the folder back across the table. "Then we're done." Charles's smile disappeared. "You should think carefully." "I already have. I can't be bought." Charles quietly gathered the folder and left. Daniel looked toward the apartment door. Victoria never came. He waited for almost an hour. She never arrived. He had no idea she had heard only the first sentence. She didn't call Daniel. She couldn't. If she spoke to him, she feared she'd hear another lie. By sunrise, the apartment looked almost empty. Mrs. Kaplan arrived later that morning. "I heard you're leaving." Victoria forced a smile. "My family needs me." Mrs. Kaplan hugged her. "You'll always have a place here." Victoria looked around the bookstore one last time. The children's reading corner. The old wooden bench Daniel had repaired. The coffee machine they joked about every morning. The life she had finally learned to love. She left her employee badge inside the cash register. Next to it, she placed the very first bookstore receipt Daniel had accidentally signed instead of the customer. She smiled through tears. Then she walked away. For weeks, Daniel visited the bookstore almost every day. Mrs. Kaplan could only tell him one thing. She left. No address. She shook her head. No phone number? Another shake. Daniel looked at the empty reading bench. For the first time since losing his mother, he felt completely helpless. Had she discovered that he knew? Had she stopped trusting him? Or had he simply never known her at all? Winter arrived. Victoria returned to her old life. Magazine covers. Board meetings. Luxury cars. Public appearances. Yet none of it felt like home anymore. She smiled for cameras, then cried alone at night. Daniel buried himself in work. Emily watched her brother slowly become a different person. He laughed less, talked less, stopped listening to music while cooking. Even the Friday cinnamon rolls disappeared. One snowy evening, Emily quietly placed 2 cinnamon rolls on the kitchen table. "You forgot." Daniel looked at them for a long moment. "I didn't forget." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "They just don't taste the same anymore." Emily looked at her brother and knew one thing with absolute certainty. Something about Victoria's disappearance didn't feel right. She didn't know why. She didn't have proof. But somewhere, hidden beneath all the unanswered questions, the truth was still waiting to be found. Life had continued. At least that was what everyone believed. Victoria Hayes had returned to the public eye. Every business magazine called her the future of Hayes International. She attended board meetings. She gave speeches. She smiled for photographs. But every time reporters asked if she was seeing anyone, her smile faded just enough for her father to notice. Richard Hayes had watched his daughter pretend to be happy for months. One evening, after another charity dinner, he found her sitting alone in the mansion's library. She was staring at a small object resting in her palm. A faded bookstore receipt. The ink had almost disappeared. Richard sat beside her. "You still carry it?" Victoria nodded. "It reminds me of the only time I ever felt normal." Richard looked at her carefully. "Then why didn't you fight for it?" Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "Because I heard him choose money." Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked one quiet question. "Did you hear the entire conversation?" Victoria frowned. "What do you mean?" "You've always told me that truth deserves the whole story." She looked down. For the first time, she realized she had never stayed long enough to hear Daniel's answer. That thought refused to leave her. Unlike everyone else, Emily never accepted that Victoria had simply disappeared without a reason. Something felt wrong. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who chased money. And Victoria wasn't the kind of woman who played games with people's hearts. One Saturday afternoon, while helping Daniel clean old boxes from the garage, Emily found a folder marked Bookstore. Inside were small memories Daniel had quietly kept. A bookmark, a photograph taken during a neighborhood reading event, a coffee loyalty card, and the very first receipt Victoria had accidentally signed instead of a customer. Emily turned the receipt over. On the back, written in tiny handwriting, were the words, "Some people are worth waiting for." Victoria had written it months before she disappeared. Emily whispered to herself, "Someone who planned to use my brother wouldn't write this." The receipt became the first piece of a puzzle. Daniel had never deleted Victoria's voicemail. It was only 12 seconds long. "Hi, it's Victoria. I found that mystery novel you wanted. Stop by after work if you still want it." Emily listened several times. Then something caught her attention. In the background, a man's voice could barely be heard saying, "Mr. Monroe is here." Emily froze. Monroe. Charles Monroe. Why would one of the most powerful executives in America be anywhere near a neighborhood bookstore? The question led her to something even stranger. Emily visited Mrs. Kaplan. The elderly bookstore owner welcomed her warmly. After hearing everything, Mrs. Kaplan disappeared into the storage room. She returned carrying a dusty cardboard box. "I almost threw these away." Inside were security camera backup drives from the bookstore. Most had been damaged. Only one still worked. Mrs. Kaplan smiled. "I always keep everything." Emily found a local technician willing to recover the footage. Hours later, a grainy video appeared on the screen. It showed Charles Monroe entering the bookstore 2 weeks before Victoria disappeared. He wasn't shopping. He walked directly toward Victoria. They spoke for nearly 10 minutes. There was no audio, but Charles handed Victoria a business card before leaving. Emily's heart raced. Charles had known exactly where Victoria was. Long before anyone else. Emily requested a meeting with Richard Hayes. She expected to be turned away. Instead, Richard welcomed her into his office. She placed the recovered footage on his desk. Richard watched silently. His expression slowly changed. Then Emily showed him the bookstore receipt, the voicemail, the photographs, everything. Richard pressed a button on his desk. Find out everything Charles Monroe did during the last year. Within 48 hours, the company's internal investigators uncovered a trail of deleted emails, hidden payments, and private meetings. Charles had been working with outside investors who wanted control of Hayes International. Victoria's disappearance had given him the perfect opportunity. If she married someone he could manipulate, he could influence the future of the company. When Daniel refused to cooperate, Charles changed his plan. He manipulated them into destroying their own relationship. The event celebrated something Victoria had dreamed about during her time at the bookstore. A free literacy center for children. Daniel's architecture firm had designed the building. Neither he nor Victoria knew the other would be there. When Victoria stepped onto the stage, she saw Daniel standing near the back of the crowd. Time seemed to stop. Before either of them could move, Richard approached the microphone. "Before we celebrate today, I believe the truth deserves a voice." The crowd looked confused. Charles Monroe shifted uneasily. Emily walked onto the stage carrying a small box. She removed one item after another. The bookstore receipt, the recovered photograph, the security footage, the voicemail recording. Then the company's lead investigator presented the final piece. A recording from the hallway outside Daniel's apartment. It had been captured by a neighboring apartment's security camera. The audio played through the speakers. Everyone heard Charles say, "If you stay close to her." The recording continued. "You'll never have to worry about money again." Then Daniel's voice answered, "I don't care how much money you're offering. If hurting innocent people is the price, then we're done." Silence. Victoria covered her mouth. Those were the words she had never stayed long enough to hear. Charles tried to interrupt. "It's taken out of context." The investigator calmly projected financial records onto the giant screen. Secret payments, hidden accounts, forged documents, edited recordings. Everything. Police officers stepped forward. One officer gently placed handcuffs on Charles. As he was escorted away, he looked at Victoria. "I only gave you what you already feared." Victoria didn't answer, because she knew he was right. His lies had succeeded only because they matched the doubts she already carried. Rows of colorful books surrounded them. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Victoria whispered, "I'm sorry." Daniel looked at her. "So am I. I should have stayed. I should have asked you why you lied." She nodded. "I thought pretending to be poor would help me find someone who loved me." Daniel smiled sadly. "I already loved the woman stocking books, drinking bad coffee, and arguing with me about mystery novels." A tear rolled down Victoria's cheek. "I was afraid the truth would make you leave." Daniel shook his head. "The lie did." They both laughed softly through their tears. For the first time in months, the silence between them no longer hurt. Months later, The Children's Literacy Center became one of the city's most successful community programs. Victoria chose to spend several days each week there instead of inside corporate offices. Daniel continued designing schools, libraries, and affordable housing projects. Richard gradually stepped back from the company, proud that his daughter had become the leader he always hoped she would be. Emily completed nursing school and became the first medical coordinator for the Literacy Foundation's Family Outreach Program. Mrs. Kaplan's bookstore received funding to expand, but only after she reluctantly accepted it. Victoria insisted on one condition: no sign saying who donated. Mrs. Kaplan smiled. "I had a feeling you'd say that." Daniel noticed Victoria studying the old bench. "The first thing I ever fixed here." She smiled. "And the first thing that made me notice you." He reached into his pocket. The faded bookstore receipt. He handed it back to her. "I think this belongs to you." Victoria held it gently before slipping her hand into his. She looked toward the bookstore window, the place where she had finally discovered the kind of life money could never buy. Then she smiled and said, "I spent my whole life thinking love was something I had to test. It turned out, it was something I only had to trust." If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.